Oh, welcome everyone to another edition of Bad News, the media criticism show the right deserves. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
This is going to be a jam-packed episode, and I know Ben and I are both really excited about this because the topics today, we couldn't believe some of the things that were coming out. We're actually going to start with breaking news about Hunter Biden. Let me play a clip right here at the top.
Was that your laptop?
For real, I don't know.
I know, but you know that this is.
I really don't know. Okay. The answer is.
You don't know, yes or no, if the laptop.
I don't have
was
any
yours.
idea. I have no idea.
So could have been yours.
Of course, certainly. There could be a laptop out there that was stolen from me. There could be that I was hacked. It could be that it was Russian intelligence. It could be that it was stolen from me.
All right, give me a break. So first of all, what he just did say was, of course, certainly. And then also said, but of course, it could also be Russian disinformation. That was from an interview that he gave recently to CBS. I think the full thing will be airing soon, but that clip just in and of itself, he says, of course, certainly. Here's what Byron York said. NPR was forced to add a correction. And for the purposes of this show where we talk about the media corruption and we break all of this down, this is certainly super relevant. Here's something from our own Molly Hemingway. You can see what Molly had to say right there. Ben, what's your take on this breaking news and how it reflects on the media?
Yeah, it could have been an 800-pound person in his basement. It could have been China. It could have been QAnon army. Honestly, it's embarrassing to watch that questioning. The primary question should have been, did you or did you not bring a laptop to this Delaware store to get it repaired? And even like leaving aside the fact that is obviously sort of the basis of the whole thing, why not actually show on screen, here's some of the things that were depicted on that. Can you authenticate this or not? Here's an email with your name on it that was collected from this trove. Is this an accurate email or not? It's also laughable to think that we're talking about the son of the president of the United States, and like he wouldn't have had, or they wouldn't have had forensic investigators looking at it. It strains credulity. And I think we have to put this in context of the fact that he has this book coming out. And there are some other clips emerging from this interview as well, that portray him as this sort of sympathetic character who had terrible addiction problems and his family helped get him through it. And that's kind of the meta narrative of the entire Hunter Biden saga. And as we've talked about, actually, in my opinion, I think he is something of a sympathetic character because I think he has been actually in some ways taken advantage of by his family to the extent that these business dealings, the benefits of them that are out there actually accrued to his family. And he was sort of serving as a front man for his family. But set all that aside, the broader context is this is about trying to cleanse information about Hunter to get past all of the Hunter Biden stories to protect the big guy, Joe Biden. The other part of this is there really are national security implications to what may have been on that computer and what appears by all accounts to be authentic emails showing business dealings with figures working under adversarial regimes, many of them of which have criminal ties, namely including the Chinese Communist Party, but also in Russia, the Ukraine, and beyond. There are major national security implications to this, and that's the big story. All of the salacious things that appear to have fallen out from whatever was on that computer, those are stories, obviously, in and of themselves, and people are interested in them. But the substantive issue here is, look, if you're the son of the president of the United States and you have all these dealings with foreign adversaries, obviously there are major avenues for compromise, corruption that actually impact the life and limb of American citizens at the end of the day and present obvious conflicts of interest and beyond. So, of course, there's the laughable aspect of going back to this is Russia, Russia, Russia again. And that's one dodge. And that's the same dodge that Joe Biden used. And by the way, they're spewing disinformation, it appears here. And they had the entire intelligence community laundering that same, or senior members of the intelligence community laundering that same narrative through the press as well. Let's not forget. And then you have the big tech aspect of the suppression here as well. But the broader thing is, I think the media is missing. They're not missing. They're intentionally obfuscating over the most significant thing of this, which is the national security implications to it.
Well, I want to pick up on that point because I think that's central to everything that we're talking about here, which is that this is a story, the laptop story, that was downplayed or outright banned from their platforms by big tech. And it was something that the media, as Byron York's tweet right here shows, the NPR is now correcting a position that much of the corporate press was insistent on and condescended and mocked conservative media for holding by saying, listen, what's going on with this laptop is legitimately newsworthy information. It is not Russian disinformation. The FBI, Mike Pompeo at the time, everybody came out and said they had no reason to believe the laptop was Russian disinformation. The laptop story was Russian disinformation. It's a crazy story. But the media said that this was not legitimately a factor in the presidential election. They purposefully took steps to downplay it. This is the media, the people who need to be hungry for stories and hungry for truth and hungry to hold people in power to account. And actually what they did was work in concert with big tech to downplay a major story. And here we are. It is now April of 2021. NPR is adding a correction to their story, which reflected a position that was held by a wide swath of everybody in the corridors of power. And they took action to support that position. They actually acted in support of their position. It wasn't just an opinion that they expressed on panels. This was something that they actively suppressed. And that happened in Silicon Valley, and that happened in DC and Manhattan newsrooms. And here we are, April 2021, NPR is adding a correction. Hunter is saying certainly the laptop could be his in an interview to promote his new book, which basically allows him to do this sort of public relations cleanup effort, which, by the way, I think is brilliant. And I do agree that he's kind of a sympathetic character because he's had a life of tragedy and a lot of pain, et cetera, et cetera. But oh my gosh, this all brings me back to what Ben said, that there are actual national security implications here. This isn't just about sort of like, this isn't just about, you know, hurting the Bidens or scoring political points. There are serious implications, and there are serious implications to the media's malfeasance. So by the media sitting this one out, and I shouldn't even say sitting this one out, by the media suppressing this, because they didn't sit it out. Actually, they suppressed it. So by the media working with big tech to suppress the story months and months and months ago, the American people did not have really accurate an accurate rendering of the story. They did not have accurate information, and it, you know, obviously, I'm sure it impacted the presidential election. I'm sure it's impacted the choices that the Biden team has made since then. And those choices will have ramifications, as Ben articulated very clearly, for our national security. So this isn't just some sort of like fun rhetorical exercise that conservatives are doing to score points. There's serious reasons, and we shouldn't have to explain that.
Yeah, the only other point that I'd add is in the realm of journalistic malfeasance here, and there's journalistic malfeasance at every level. But again, I go back to, is it malfeasance, or in the media's view, is it actually just doing its job by protecting those that it cares to protect and obfuscating and skirting the narratives that might actually be politically damaging? But the other aspect of this is, it's so easy to write the story of, look, the Senate did a joint committee investigation which showed a raft of Hunter Biden and other Biden family member business dealings with, as I mentioned, Russian figures, Ukrainian figures, Chinese Communist Party tied figures as well. Many of these figures were oligarchs or 2 degrees separated from oligarchs and connected to government officials and the like. And there were obviously sketchy aspects to these transactions. It's right there in authoritative government documents. It's so easy to take those documents and say, okay, here's where there's evidence in these documents. Here's what we see in this purported laptop. We have people on the record corroborating that these are authenticated emails and the like. This story writes itself. Even if you wanted to cover for Joe Biden, and you probably could, you could probably take these stories and say, well, look, you know, we looked at the business dealings, and yes, they might present some uncomfortable issues, but everything was above board. Or they could find a way to spin it and still at least portray what's out there. It's embarrassing. It's an indictment of the media that you have here these very basic data points that are right there smacking you in the face, staring you down in the throes of a presidential election, and that you choose to ignore it once again shows that they believe that their job is political activism, not to expose the truth for us. Now, as we'll get to, it's a good segue to the next segment. They believe that their political activism is the truth and doing God's work, and that's why they do it.
I was just going to say, what a perfect segue into the second topic. So I'm going to roll the clip right now. This is of Lester Holt from NBC.
The unprecedented attacks on the press in this period, I'm sure, will fill plenty of books and be studied in classrooms, maybe even here. But I have a few early observations I'll share about where this moment brings us and what we can learn. Number one is, I think it's become clearer that fairness is overrated. Well, before you run off and tweet that headline, let me explain a bit. The idea that we should always give two sides equal weight and merit does not reflect the world we find ourselves in. That the sun sets in the west is a fact. Any contrary view does not deserve our time or attention. Now, I know recent events assure that you won't have to look far to find more current and relevant examples. I think you get my point. Decisions to not give unsupported arguments equal time are not a dereliction of journalistic responsibility or some kind of agenda. In fact, it's just the opposite. Providing an open platform for misinformation, for anyone to come say whatever they want, especially when issues of public health and safety are at stake, can be quite dangerous. Our duty is to be fair to the truth. Holding those in power accountable is at the core of our function and responsibility. We need to hear our leaders' views, their policies and reasoning. It's really important, but we have to stand ready to push back and call out falsehoods.
All right, so that was a clip courtesy of the Media Research Center and Newsbusters, as we just saw at the end. I wanted to play basically the whole thing because it's so important. I think Lester Holt is somebody who's actually capable of articulating it intelligently, even though it's a wildly dangerous, reckless, and just all around bad way to approach his job. But, you know, this is something that we see a lot of, I think, younger millennial journalists, and Ben and I are both millennials, so millennial on millennial criticism is totally fair game for us. But, you know, this is something we see a lot of people articulate a lot less articulately than Lester Holt just did. And it's a really key way to understanding how the media currently sees its role. They believe that they're the people that can sort fact from fiction. And we've seen them do just a spectacularly terrible job at handling that responsibility, as they say it. Fairness is overrated. Ben, what did you think about Lester Holt?
Setting aside for a second the smugness and the sanctimonious nature of it, I recalled also as I was watching that the first few times, because you really need to watch it a few times to fully absorb what's being said there. The New York Times itself also sort of dropped the mask during the Trump years and said, look, we have to call it out now. You know, it's just so clear what is truth and what is not truth. Really, what narrative is the right narrative and what narrative runs afoul of the official narrative, and only the official narrative must be allowed to prevail. And it's just so clear. Again, we sort of go back to this question a lot of, do they actually believe what they're saying, or do they know that they're being kind of cynical propagandists? And I think you've made the case, you've articulated the case, and I think you're convincing me that they really do believe what they are feeding us, most of them. What you see here is, in their view, it's sort of the pinnacle of the progressive ideology of, we can put wise, enlightened technocrats in place, and they know what truth is, and they know how to govern society accordingly. So as long as you hew to their view of the truth, it's fine. We can have a wide degree of debate in a very narrow area where we all accept certain basic things. But anything else is complete conspiracy theory, misinformation, toxic disinformation, and it's going to get people killed. Okay, again, this is from the media of Russiagate. We just talked about the media talking about this whole conspiracy theory about Russia stealing Hunter Biden's laptop, or maybe even being responsible for the information that was floated out that emanated from the laptop. It's laughable for them to talk about being arbiters of truth when they've propagated one of the most pernicious, slanderous, awful conspiracies on the country over the last 4 years, which had the effect, essentially, of halting the agenda of a president of the United States. That was the effect of Russiagate. It put a cloud over the entire presidency. It made the president expand massive amount of resources having nothing to do with actually executing and discharging his duties. And whether or not you agreed with what the policies were, it had a massive effect, a corrosive, corrupting Russiagate conspiracy theory. That was the power of the media, arbiters of truth, to distort and harm our democracy in broad daylight. So that's the truth about our media, first of all. But the second point is, again, he makes it seem essentially as if the views of half the country are completely unjustifiable and not backed by any substance or merit whatsoever. And it's simply false. And we're going to run through it in the last story that we covered today, exactly what the facts are on certain issues and why half the country has concerns over issues that the small minority that dominate the commanding heights of society, the likes of Lester Holt and his colleagues, they don't see that there actually are merits to why we feel the way that we do about certain issues. There actually are facts that back it and justify it. And it's actually this extreme minority in our ruling class that oftentimes shoots from the hip and doesn't have any basis for their assertions. So the hypocrisy, the smugness, the sanctimony is on perfect display there. And we need to bottle that up. And we should probably go back to that clip every quarter or every month, because it so perfectly encapsulates where our ruling class is. They don't believe that there ought to be any dissenting opinion because their truth is the only truth. And by the way, that's one last point. He's talking about truth here and that there's only one truth, but this is from the side that always talks about my truth and my lived experiences, as if we all have our own truths. So is there one truth or are there myriad truths? Do you believe that there is such a thing as morality, or is there moral relativism and that's the definition of morality? They're so inconsistent and hypocritical on these points. It's laughable to watch. And these are our betters. These are the people who are our tastemakers, our curators and the like in our society. It's a sad commentary on our society that the likes of Lester Holt are the ones representing these kinds of views. Well,
and here's what you don't get on any other media criticism show, I think, is like at the core of all of this is the incoherency of the modern left's philosophy. Is they don't know whether they're moral relativists or if they're moral like extremists, where they
absolutist.
Think right. Yeah. Absolutist is exactly the word that I was fumbling for there. But that's a completely what explains what's at the heart of all of these things. And Lester Holt is telling us right there that he, a man that represents a network that was behind all of these different Russiagate stories. NBC News did some really bad reporting on that. You can just ask Fusion Ken Delanian about any of that. But you had NBC News doing the terrible reporting on that. We had the media doing the terrible reporting on Hunter Biden, as we just talked about. And they're saying, give us the keys, right? Like we are the people who can determine what is true and what is not true. They're the least capable of determining what is true or not true because they are so drunk on their own ideology, as Ben just completely explained well. They're so drunk on that they're incapable of determining what's true and what's not true. And I mean drunk in the way that like they're actually like blinded from seeing it's like they're literally drunk on this ideology, to the point where rational sort of thinking is difficult for them. And they're insisting, as Lester Holt just said, and I think he's speaking for a lot of the media when he says that, they're insisting that they're the ones that can sort fact from fiction. And that's really, really dangerous. It also implies that the American people are too stupid to do it for themselves, that you can't hear spin from politicians. You can't hear somebody who's saying, don't get a vaccine. It's, for all of these crazy reasons, et cetera, et cetera. And you can't sort those from the good reasons that people might have to question what's happening in the supply chain or something like that, that you're too stupid. You're just too dumb. The American people are too dumb to do this for themselves. Thus, we must step in and do it for you. And that's just completely ridiculous because they're so incapable of doing it. And actually, I'm going to do something we don't do all the time, but just totally blend the segment into the last one here, because this tweet from my old boss, Tim Carney at the Washington Examiner, it's just the perfect example of why Lester Holt is crazy to say what he just said. This is Joe Biden quoted in CBS, a CBS story, talking about the Georgia election law. Now, the Georgia election law is something the media has been mangling. Tim says Biden doesn't even mind lying because he knows places like CBS will simply print this as if it's true. And the point is that when Donald Trump would say something like that was as factually inaccurate, or even when he said something factually accurate, the media would never let his quote just stand. It would always have to be contextualized. This is why Donald Trump is completely wrong. Even when he was right, they would always have to contextualize it with a little snarky fact check in the copy from reporters, not from opinion writers, not from blah, 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 like literally from reporters in the copy of reported news pieces. Now, Joe Biden can completely lie and hyperbolize about something, and CBS prints it, as Tim said, as though it's true. And Lester Holt is saying that we're the ones capable of determining fact from fiction, truths from falsehoods. And here we have right there a clear falsehood that the media is printing as though it's true. Ben, connect the dots here. What the hell is going on?
Yeah, well, let me jump back because you hit on something that's really critical about our media and why I would make the case we should today view most of the corporate media as just an extension of our political class, that I've called it the communications arm of our bipartisan, largely progressive
Absolutely.
ruling class. There's an issue of they'll get it wrong so much. Why should they ever be counted on to discern between fact and fiction and what's misinformation versus real information? But then the other part is, why do they want to play? Why should they play God? How is it moral for them to play God, to be the ones determining this stuff for us in the first place? And it's the same thing. It's the same core principle in progressivism. It's not only that the progressives think their policies are right, but they think they have a moral obligation on behalf of everyone else to make decisions for them. So I view the media's actions as an extension of progressive ideology. Now, we can make an argument whether or not the media should be in that elevated position to try to make these determinations for us. Certainly, I think we all agree the politicians should not be the ones making these decisions. We make decisions for ourselves. We elect representatives to govern according to our consent, even though they don't do that. But nevertheless, that's at least the principle. But the progressive principle is we are the benighted, enlightened, intelligent, moral ones, and society will be far better off if you turn the keys over to us and let us rule over you. And I think our media has that exact same view. It's a condescending view. It's the soft bigotry of low expectations towards their fellow Americans. And it's also kind of what you get when you have putatively elite credentialed people all together in smoke-filled rooms or not, whatever you'd call the equivalent today, safe spaces, coddled with lattes, I don't know. And they're the ones that make decisions for the rest of us.
I have a latte right here.
Well,
I'm sort of in my safe space.
Look, we can all enjoy our ruling class chic little luxury, but we should still point out this kind of the insanity of it all, and goes back to, as you always bring up, the Charles Murray coming apart aspect of all of this. But in any event, to the merits of the story itself, here you have, of course, something that if you fact checked falls apart in 5 seconds. Read the text of the bill. That's the first thing. A real media, the first thing they would do is they would look at the text of the bill, look at what people are commenting about it, and say, here's where it conflicts, or here's where it's accurate. Mm-hmm. Very simple. That's what purported journalists should do. Because they don't do that, they let these lies slide, all as a part of a much broader narrative, which of course is, as you often point to, progressive or bigot. Anyone who believes that we shouldn't have mass mail-in balloting, that ballot harvesting is a recipe for fraud, corruption, and disaster, that we shouldn't have a rolling election day, but a single election day, that you should have to show identification at a voting booth, and that the further we get away from a single voting day, in person, showing ID, the greater the odds are of fraud, corruption, and a whole mass of things that actually do make our democracy die in broad daylight. And that history does show, in fact, that has happened. That there's been plenty of fraud and corruption cases that you can point to. And in fact, even the New York Times itself used to harp on these issues if you go back over the last 2 decades. In any event, Biden's just wrong factually. There's nothing in the bill that prevents voting from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. actually. And we can run through some of the other facts as well. They talk about you can't bring drinks to people in line. No, it's certain people, namely partisan actors, can't bring things to people in line. We could talk about the fact, as the Wall Street Journal pointed out, I believe, in an editorial recently, that there's a much longer early voting period in Georgia than I believe there is in his home in New York City, I believe. And then versus Delaware, there are also some standards that are also far more lax that Georgia has implemented and put into place. But all of this is about a narrative of racist, bigoted Southern Republican states, although that state went for him. So maybe he should be careful with how he's attacking that state. And the broader issue of this is Republicans trying to suppress votes across the country. Again, leaving aside the fact that, for example, and Jason Riley has written about this at length for the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, voter turnout among minorities has gone up in the very states that have implemented things like voter ID standards throughout the South and across the country as well. So there are all sorts of facts you could point to that would puncture that narrative, leaving aside, of course, the bad faith framing of evil, bigoted conservatives don't want black people to vote, which is what they're saying. And they should just say that openly, because we all know that that's a dog whistle that they're putting out there. rather than, of course, that, maybe there is a counter narrative, which is you need to have vote integrity. Otherwise, legal, lawful voters find their votes diluted and they're suppressed and disenfranchised. But that narrative cannot stand. That's a bigoted, evil narrative. It goes back to the progressive or bigoted binary. And it shows that it is such BS when they talk about fact checking. No, they're not fact checking. They're criticizing their political adversaries and they're protecting and running interference for their political friends. And that's all this is. And again, one of the things why we need shows like this is strip away the pretense and call it like it is. And I'd love to see a counter from the other side on this. But the fact that there is an other side, as opposed to a media which says, look, here are the claims that are made by political actors on both sides. Here's the substance of the bill. Now let's judge those comments on the merits. That they never do that is, again, a complete indictment of our purported media.
Well, here's a column by Carl Cannon over at Real Clear Politics, and it's a really interesting, he makes a really interesting point about how basically offensive what Joe Biden has said about the Georgia voting law is, and what, for our purposes, that's something the media should be articulating. And Carl Cannon is one of the few people I've seen actually express how ridiculous this is. It's an excellent column. I suggest everybody read it. But this has been completely absent from the media's coverage of the bill, is that like Jim Crow was all of these things. Jim Crow was all of these different things. And the Georgia election law is nowhere close to that. But prominent Democrats, from the president of the United States to Stacey Abrams, have been able to repeat their talking point. And it's a talking point. I guarantee you it's on their little talking point emails about how this is. I heard Tyler Perry say it. Tyler Perry, Joe Biden, Stacey Abrams, about how this is harkens back to Jim Crow. This is Jim Crow 2.0. This is Jim Eagle. They've been able to spread these talking points on the media or on media outlets without any pushback, almost none. In fact, actually, the media has added it. They have added to that narrative. They have come in with further falsehoods to say that this is all of the things that the bill doesn't let you do. It doesn't let you give people water, and like that's crazy. No, if the media wants to add context and if the media wants to sort fact from fiction, here's the perfect opportunity for them to do it, because the Democratic Party and the broader left has been spewing nonstop BS about what this Georgia voter law actually is, and it's spreading disinformation to so many people who are not well served by the narrative, people who are getting completely misinformed by what the left is saying. This is the media's perfect opportunity to add context and say, they love adding context. They love to say everything needs to be contextualized. If Donald Trump says something that's true, we still need to contextualize it and say it's precedented or it's unprecedented, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the perfect opportunity to go in and say exactly as Ben did. Well, actually, Delaware has this. Or actually, look at what Jason Riley has said. That's a fair point. Maybe we should add that context. Nope. They're not going to do it here because it totally fits their ideological narrative, and they have so much less curiosity when it comes to fact-checking or questioning or engaging in sort of skeptical, rigorous analyses of Democratic talking points and Democratic policy proposals. It's outrageous. The country now thinks what's happening in Georgia is similar to Jim Crow in any way whatsoever, is a totally false rendering of what's happening in Georgia and what's happening in this country. It's disgusting. It does not serve the public well. It is dividing us. It is making us hate each other. It's making us think that our lives are much more miserable than they actually are. And that's the media's fault in this case. They had every opportunity to fact check Democrats. They had every opportunity to add the context, but they don't really want to do that. They only really want to do that when it comes to their own ideological narratives. And it's a real shame because we need people to do this. And to your point, Ben, at this point, the only thing that we can do is hope that a new media infrastructure flourishes, because we're sort of seeing the bones of that on Substack and on Patreon, and conservative media has been experimenting with it for years. And we're seeing the bones of a robust infrastructure pop up. But we have to just hope that that flourishes and that people's eyeballs go away from the corporate press, because there's no hope. I mean, when you have all of this happening, when you have them getting the Hunter Biden story wrong, them getting Russian collusion wrong, we have them now getting this Georgia election law completely wrong. I mean, just like wildly wrong in so many different ways. And Lester Holt is saying, he's doubling down and saying we need to be checking. We need to be, saying that fiction is fact more and more and more, and you need to trust us. And that's Lester Holt. That's not someone working for Salon or Slate or the New Republic. This is the nightly news anchor for one of the news networks saying it and speaking on behalf of a wide swath of the legacy media. And so when you have that combination of factors, literally there is no reforming the corporate press at this point, because they're getting the stories wrong and doubling down on, their power and their need for power. So, I mean, I know that's like super pessimistic, and we have the beautiful spring weather, and everyone might be feeling like happy that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. But really the only hope for a fourth estate to sort of reemerge, a true fourth estate to reemerge, is turning to a new media infrastructure.
And that's exactly why, as we've talked about ad nauseum on this show, the legacy media is trying to destroy all of the independent sources of information and attack the journalists who have been relegated to these alternative platforms as well. And I think, to summarize the Lester Holt view of the world, which is now the corporate media view of the world, I think we have to view it this way. In their view, the science is settled. Leftism is the religion of the state. It is the religion or anti-religion that must govern all of our lives. There is no alternative to it. And thus heretics, like those relegated to Substack and elsewhere and all the conservative publications, ought to be crushed and destroyed and excommunicated from American life. I guess my question would be, show me counter evidence to that. I don't need to say that the media is a bunch of left-wing hacks and all they want to do is help their team win and impose their ideology on us. What I would simply say is, show me the counter evidence to that. And it's almost impossible to identify examples of it. And oftentimes the few people who might skirt the standards that the corporate media has created, of course, are the ones whose heads roll ultimately. And that's where we are, as this woke revolution rolls through and no one stands up to it.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, like it sounds pessimistic, but it's just accurate at this point, and we do ourselves no good to pretend that the media is not utterly corrupt to its core and that there is some sort of way to redeem it or to reform it. There's no point anymore, because we're just so far beyond that. I mean, the media is too far gone when you have a nightly news anchor who's generally perceived as sort of the mild-mannered, moderate man of the media, at least the sort of like among the power players, and he's coming out and speaking like that. Like a lot of people 5 years ago heard, young millennial reporters talk about at like Salon or the Daily Beast. Here we now have in 2021, Lester Holt speaking that way. And I think, again, speaking on behalf of a lot of people in the media. Ben, do you have any final thoughts on this before we let people enjoy the weekend the best they can with all this in mind?
You have to, I think that it pays to kind of laugh at some of this, because it is, the Babylon Bee is real life. And that's where we are now. I used to say we're living the Onion, but the Onion is now gone, of course, as sort of a left-wing satirical rag. So we're living the Babylon Bee every single day, and there is something hilarious about it. We still have to wake up and the sun does rise every morning, and to, I guess, stick with the sun analogy, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and that's what we try to do on this show. The media discredits itself, but it needs to be called out on it. We don't expect it to reform its behavior, but nevertheless, it deserves the critique that we richly give it every single day, or every 2 days a week on this show, maybe someday every single day, because there's an infinite amount of material to work with here. But we exist to, if nothing else, this can serve as a group therapy session for those of us seeing all of the truly toxic and dangerous messages being propagated by our corporate media, our purported betters, on a weekly basis. And we thank you for joining us in this group therapy session. And grab a cold one later tonight. I guess it's Friday. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Baseball season, so we've got that.
Heck yeah. Well, yeah. And Ben used a phrase earlier today. He said, bottle up. And I think this episode is one of those that you can just kind of bottle up and say, listen, we have this like logical flow from the Hunter Biden, NPR issuing a correction to its Hunter Biden laptop, piece, to the poor Georgia voting coverage, all the way down to Lester Holt then asking for even more trust and more power after getting these major narratives factually wrong wrong again and again, and sort of hypocritically failing to examine them with the rigor that they seek to apply to the right. And so this is one of those episodes where if people are asking you, why you engage in those unprecedented attacks on the free press that Lester Holt condemned, why do you engage in that? Well, just take this episode as an example. Put this in your pocket. Keep these stories in your pocket, because this is a perfect explanation in a nutshell of why the media is irredeemable and corrupt to its core. And so this is one to, like I just said, just keep this one in your pocket. Keep all this in mind as we go forward. And we just thank you for tuning in. We're here every Wednesday and Friday morning, usually around 10:30. So subscribe, stay tuned. This is bad news. We call ourselves the media criticism show the right deserves. We're brought to you by the Federalist. And we'll be back next Wednesday with more. Until then, I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben